Some folks spend their whole lives judging a parcel by the paper around it, never wondering what weather it crossed to reach their door. The frontier was full of such people, quick to measure a woman by her face, her age, or the strength of her step. But a lonely house does not care about appearances. It knows only whether the hands entering it have come to take warmth or make it. Harriet Gentry had one boot on the station platform when the train lurched behind her and nearly pulled her backward beneath its wheels. She caught herself on the brass handle of a brown traveling trunk, the one with a spray of painted bluebells fading across its lid. Hot cinders struck the shoulder of her gray dress. Steam rolled past her face, wet and bitter with coal smoke, while the westbound cars groaned away from Red Mesa, Arizona territory, leaving her in a cloud of dust and white vapor. A dozen townspeople had gathered beside the depot to meet the afternoon train. Only one man stepped forward. Silas Crow wore a black town coat despite the heat. His boots shone, his beard had been trimmed to a narrow point, and in his right hand he held the photograph Harriet had mailed east 4 months before, or thought she had mailed. He looked from the photograph to Harriet. Then he looked again. The station master stopped rolling a barrel. 2 women near the hitching rail leaned close to one another. A boy carrying newspapers stood with his mouth open. Silas' face tightened, as if Harriet had offered him spoiled meat. "You are Harriet Gentry." "Yes." Her voice stayed level, though the fingers wrapped around her trunk handle had begun to tremble. Silas raised the photograph for everyone to see. The woman pictured there was slim-faced, pale-haired, and perhaps 22. Harriet was 31, brown-haired, broad-shouldered, and marked by a thin burn scar that ran from the corner of her left jaw beneath her collar. Her right leg had never fully straightened after a wagon accident in Missouri, and when she was tired, as she was now, the limp could not be hidden. "This ain't you?" Harriet stared at the photograph. For one terrible second, the whole platform seemed to tilt. "That is my sister, Evelyn." A murmur moved through the crowd. Silas gave a dry laugh. "Your sister. I gave the matrimonial office my own portrait. Well, they sent me this one." Harriet lifted her chin. "Then they deceived us both." Silas' eyes moved over her scar, her sturdy hands, and the worn toes of her boots. "Deceived me more than you, I reckon." The women by the rail laughed softly. Harriet's grip tightened on the bluebell trunk. Silas folded the photograph and slipped it into his pocket. "You are not what I ordered." The words struck harder than the heat. He turned as though the matter were settled. Harriet spoke before he could leave. "Mr. Crow, you paid for my ticket. I crossed 1,600 miles believing we had entered an honest agreement. I do not expect you to marry a stranger against your will, but I will need lodging until I can arrange work and repay the fare." Silas glanced toward the watching townspeople. Shame did not touch him. If anything, their attention seemed to stiffen his pride. "You misrepresented yourself. I owe you nothing. I did not send that photograph." "That is easy to say." He stepped around her trunk. The boy with the newspapers shifted aside to let him pass. Then another man came through the crowd. He was taller than Silas, though he seemed to take up less space because he did not carry himself for other people's notice. Dust covered his hat, shirt, and sun-darkened face. One sleeve was mended at the elbow with thread several shades too light. A leather rein hung from his left hand, and there was dried blood along one knuckle. He stopped beside Harriet's trunk. "Crow." Silas turned. "Sawyer, you leaving her here?" "She ain't my concern." The dusty man looked at Harriet, but not in the way Silas had looked. His eyes did not pause on her scar or limp. They settled first on her face, then on the trunk, then on the empty track behind her. "She got money for a room?" Silas' mouth curled. "Ask her." Harriet answered for herself. "I have $1.40. The station master lowered his eyes. A room at the Red Mesa Hotel cost $1 a night without supper. The dusty man considered that. Then he lifted Harriet's trunk, as though he had already decided something. Silas laughed. "Careful, Sawyer. She might expect you to marry her." The man's shoulders hardened beneath his faded shirt. He set the trunk in the back of a farm wagon and faced Silas. "No," he said. "She might expect me to behave decent." The laughter stopped. "Before we follow Harriet down that long, dusty road, tell us where you are listening from. And if her journey touches something in you, please like, share, and subscribe. There are still quiet stories worth carrying from one porch light to another." The stranger tied Harriet's trunk beneath a canvas sheet, checked the knot twice, and returned to where she stood. "My name is Malachi Sawyer." Harriet knew the name. Nearly everyone on the train had known it by the time they reached Red Mesa. Sawyer owned a cattle spread 12 miles north, though "owned" was apparently a generous word. The drought had taken half his herd. A winter fever had taken his sister and her husband. He now raised their 2 children in a house people described as too quiet even before the funerals. "I am Harriet Gentry. I hurt." He nodded toward the wagon seat. "There is a boarding room behind Mrs. Bell's laundry. She charges by the week. I can take you there." Silas had already crossed the street, but Harriet could feel him listening. "Thank you," she said. "I will repay you for the trouble." Malachi glanced at the trunk. Trouble is generally louder. He helped her climb into the wagon without touching her until the last moment, when her injured leg failed to take the step. His hand closed around her elbow, firm and brief. He did not apologize for noticing. That kindness nearly undid her more than the cruelty had. She sat stiffly beside him while he climbed up and gathered the reins. Red Mesa passed around them in sun-bleached pieces. The hotel with its crooked balcony, the dry goods store, a saloon painted the color of old blood, the church steeple beyond the cottonwoods. Faces turned as the wagon rolled by. Harriet kept her gaze on the road. Malachi did not offer comforting lies. He did not tell her people would forget. He did not say Silas Crow was a fool or that her scar hardly showed. He drove in silence until the depot vanished behind a stand of mesquite. Then he said, "Mrs. Bell's place burned last week." Harriet turned to him. "Laundry stove caught the wall. Boarding room is gone. You knew that when you offered to take me there." I remembered late. The corner of his mouth moved, though it did not become a smile. Harriet looked at the road stretching ahead, thin perhaps the hotel. "You have enough for one night. I can find work tomorrow." "Doing what?" "Whatever is honest." He flicked the reins lightly. The bay horses picked up their pace. Malachi's eyes remained on the road. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Mend harness?" "Some." "Keep accounts?" "Very well." "Handle children?" Harriet considered the question. Children are not usually handled. They are listened to, fed, corrected when necessary, and given useful work before they invent destructive work. For the first time, Malachi looked directly at her. "I have 2. I hurt. Everybody hears." He faced forward again. "The house needs help. So does the ranch. I can pay $8 a month, meals, and a room. Nothing else is part of the bargain." Harriet looked at his worn sleeve, the blood on his knuckle, and the wagon bed loaded with flour, nails, lamp oil, and a sack of chicken feed patched with twine. He did not appear to be a man who could afford $8 a month. How long? 1 month. Might be 2. And after that, I do not know. She had heard those words many times in her life. Sometimes they meant danger, sometimes honesty. Will your children object? Probably. Will the town? Certainly. Will you? His jaw tightened. I object to most changes, he said. Harriet looked back toward Red Mesa, now hidden by dust and distance. Somewhere behind them, Silas Crow was likely explaining how he had narrowly escaped a fraud. Somewhere ahead stood a house whose owner objected to change. She placed both gloved hands in her lap. $8, she said. Pay at the end of each month. Agreed. And I keep my own room. You would have to fight me for mine. She almost smiled. They rode north beneath a sky so wide that Harriet felt small enough to disappear in it. Low mountains burned purple on the horizon. The land was harsher than Missouri, stripped to stone, fawn, yellow grass, and distant cottonwoods marking hidden water. Jackrabbits scattered from the wagon ruts. A hawk circled above them without flapping its wings. Malachi spoke only when necessary. He pointed out a wash that flooded during storms, a neighboring property owned by the Renshaw family, and a low ridge where Apache riders had once washed the military road. When Harriet asked how far his cattle ranged, he said, "Not far enough." When she asked the children's names, his hand tightened on the reins. "Caleb is 9. Ruth is 6. How long since their parents died?" 8 months. Harriet did not say she was sorry. Grief that fresh was often made lonelier by polite words. The Sawyer Ranch appeared near sundown. First came a broken stretch of fence leaning into the weeds. Then a corral with 2 missing rails. A windmill stood motionless above a dry tank, while nearer the house, an iron water pump had been wrapped in burlap to slow a leak. The barn roof sagged on its western side. 3 thin horses watched from behind a gate held closed with baling wire. The house itself was built of weathered boards, with a narrow porch and 2 chimneys. One shutter hung by a single hinge. A pile of unsplit wood lay beside the chopping block, gray from neglect. 2 children stood in the doorway. The boy was narrow and sun-brown, wearing trousers too short for his ankles. He held a small rifle across his chest with practiced seriousness. The girl stood half behind him, clutching a corn-husk doll without a face. Malachi stopped the wagon. The children looked at Harriet. Harriet looked back. "This is Miss Gentry," Malachi said. "She will be staying a while and helping with the house." Caleb's eyes moved to Harriet's trunk. Is she a wife?" "No." "Did you buy her?" Malachi's face darkened. "No." Caleb looked relieved. Ruth did not. Harriet climbed down carefully. Her bad leg had stiffened during the journey. When she reached for her trunk, Malachi lifted it before she could protest. Ruth whispered something to her brother. "What did she say?" Harriet asked. Caleb straightened. "She said your face got burned." Malachi stopped on the porch. Harriet touched the thin scar near her jaw. "Part of it did." "Did it hurt?" Ruth asked. "Yes." "Did you cry?" "Yeah." Ruth studied her with solemn gray eyes. Then she held out the faceless doll. Harriet did not take it. She understood the offering was not yet a gift. It was evidence to be examined. "What is her name?" "She does not have one." "Why?" Mama was going to sew her eyes. The porch went silent. Malachi carried the trunk inside. Harriet crouched as far as her injured leg allowed. "A doll can still hear without eyes," she said. Ruth's fingers closed around the cornhusk body. "Can she?" "I believe so." Ruth nodded once and followed Malachi into the house. The kitchen smelled of cold grease, ashes, and milk gone sour. Dirty tin plates stood on the rough table. A pot of beans had burned black against the stove bottom. One curtain remained over the window, faded into a color that might once have been green. Harriet said nothing. Malachi set her trunk in a small room off the back passage. The room held an iron bed, a cracked wash basin, and a Bible on a shelf thick with dust. A woman's blue shawl hung from a peg by the door. Malachi saw Harriet looking at it. "My sisters, I can move it." "No." The word came quickly. Then he rubbed the back of his neck. "No," he repeated more quietly. "Leave it." Harriet set her gloves on the washstand. "What do the children usually eat for supper?" "Beans, the burned ones. There might be bacon." There was no bacon. There were 6 eggs, a little flour, onions sprouting in a basket, and a jar of peaches sealed the previous summer. Harriet found a crock of lard, cut the green from the onions, and made a skillet bread with eggs folded through it. She boiled water for coffee and scrubbed 4 plates while the stove heated. Malachi stood in the doorway as if uncertain whether he belonged in his own kitchen. "You do not have to begin tonight," he said. I have already begun. Caleb watched from the table. Uncle Malachi says those words when a fence breaks. What words? Already begun. Malachi gave him a look. Harriet placed the skillet bread on the table. Ruth reached first, then stopped and glanced at Malachi. He nodded. They ate quickly, not greedily, Harriet noticed. Greed meant wanting more than one needed. These children ate as though food might be removed if they did not finish before someone reconsidered. She divided the peaches into 4 bowls. Malachi pushed his toward Ruth. Harriet pushed half of hers toward Caleb. The boy frowned. I do not need yours. I did not say you did. He ate them anyway. After supper, Harriet washed dishes while Malachi carried in wood. Caleb took the slop bucket to the hens. Ruth sat on the floor and watched Harriet's hands. The pump outside shrieked each time Harriet pulled the handle. Water splashed around the base, soaking the dirt. That gasket needs replacing, she said when Malachi returned. I know. The barn roof leaks. I know. The western corral rail is down. I know. The kitchen chimney does not draw properly. He set the wood too hard beside the stove. I know what is broken here, Miss Gentry. Harriet dried her hands on a flour sack towel. Knowing is not the same as choosing what must be repaired first. His eyes met hers. For a moment, she thought she had lost the position before spending a single night. Then he looked toward the children. Pump first, he said, and chimney. I have cattle to move tomorrow. Then I will clean the chimney. He studied her gray dress. You know how? I know how to learn. That night the prairie wind pushed dust beneath the window frame. Harriet lay awake beneath a thin quilt, listening to the strange house settle around her. Once, near midnight, she heard Ruth crying. The sound stopped almost at once. Harriet waited. Footsteps crossed the passage. Malachi's voice murmured too low to understand. A door creaked. Then silence returned. On the peg beside Harriet's bed, the blue shawl stirred in the draft like someone breathing. Before dawn, she rose, folded the shawl carefully, and placed it at the foot of the bed. The first week passed through work. Harriet woke while the stars were still visible and coaxed fire from the coal stove. She learned that Malachi drank coffee black. Caleb took his with more milk than coffee, and Ruth only pretended to like it because her mother once had. Harriet made porridge when there was meal, biscuits when there was flour, and fried potatoes when neither supply would stretch. She repaired the stove damper with wire. She climbed onto the roof, despite Malachi's objections, and lowered a rope weighted with burlap through the chimney until soot poured into the hearth. She sorted the woodpile by size and taught Caleb to split kindling instead of attacking full logs with an axe too heavy for him. She scrubbed the chicken house, found 2 hidden nests, and traded extra eggs to Mrs. Renshaw for yeast and cumber seeds. The hens began laying in their boxes again. The table stopped smelling sour. Laundry no longer lay stiff in a washtub for days. Harriet heated water, grated lye soap, and pinned shirts across a rope between the porch posts. Malachi's mended sleeve flapped beside Ruth's little shift in the dry wind. Each evening, Harriet placed his clean shirt over the back of a chair. Each morning, she found the empty coffee pot rinsed and set beside the stove. No one spoke of these exchanges. Malachi repaired the pump with a gasket cut from saddle leather. Harriet packed gravel around the base so the ground would not turn to mud. Together, without planning it, they found a rhythm. He lifted what she could not. She noticed what he had stopped seeing. Caleb resisted her first. He hid one shoe before lessons. He left the hen gate open. He told Ruth that women who arrived by train always left again. Harriet did not punish him for the words. She handed him a hammer. The garden fence is loose, she said. You are old enough to fix a post. He eyed her suspiciously. Uncle Malachi does fences. Your uncle is in the south pasture. You could wait. I could. The rabbits will not. She showed him how to brace the post with stones and drive the nail at an angle. His first strike bent it. His second split the dry board. Caleb's face closed. Harriet handed him another nail. A bent nail is not a judgment. He looked at her. It only means strike straighter next time. By noon, the post stood firm. That evening, Caleb told Malachi, "I fixed the garden." Malachi inspected it after supper. "You did good work," he said. Caleb tried not to smile. Harriet began the garden with a strip of soil behind the kitchen where gray water could be carried without waste. She planted beans, squash, cumbers, onions, and marigolds against insects. Ruth followed her with a tin cup, pouring careful measures around each seed. "Will they grow?" Ruth asked. "Some. Which ones?" "The ones that can." Ruth considered this. "How do we know?" "We wait and tend all of them." Malachi heard from the porch. His gaze remained on Harriet for a long time. At the end of 2 weeks, the ranch had not become prosperous. The roof still sagged. The cattle were still thin. A note from the Red Mesa Bank remained tucked behind the mantel clock. But the house had changed its sound. Pans no longer crashed because no one could find them. The pump handle no longer shrieked. Children's feet crossed swept boards. A spoon tapped the edge of a mixing bowl. The screen door, repaired with wire and muslin, closed instead of slamming in the wind. One evening, Malachi came in after dark with blood soaking his trouser leg. Harriet saw it before he reached the table. "Sit down." "Is a scratch." "Then you may sit down without fear." He obeyed reluctantly. A horse had thrown him against a mesquite stump while he was repairing the north fence. The gash below his knee was deep and packed with dirt. Harriet heated water, cut away the cloth, and cleaned the wound while Caleb held the lamp. Malachi's hands gripped the chair seat. "You may swear," Harriet said. "Children are present." "I have heard Uncle Malachi swear." Caleb offered. "Go check the horses." "But, nah." Caleb took Ruth with him. Though both children lingered beyond the door, Harriet poured whiskey over the wound. Malachi hissed through his teeth. "Sorry, no, you are not." "No." She threaded a curved needle. He stared at it. "Where did you learn that?" "My father was a doctor. Was. He died." She pushed the needle through torn flesh. Malachi's knuckles whitened. "Your sister too?" he asked. Harriet paused. "Evelyn died 2 years ago." "The woman in the picture?" "Yes." "What happened?" "Childbed fever." "I am sorry." Harriet tied the stitch. "So am I." The room settled around them. Outside, a horse bumped the corral gate. Wind scraped a branch against the roof. Malachi looked at the scar along Harriet's jaw. Wagon, accident, fire afterward. He waited. She had grown used to people asking for the whole ugly account, as if scars were public property. Malachi did not. She cleaned the needle. "My father was driving," she said at last. "The axle broke on a hill. The lantern shattered. He got me out before the wagon burned, but his chest was crushed." Malachi looked down at her hands. "And your leg?" "Broken in 2 places. It healed poorly." "You still climbed my roof?" "It was a low roof." "It will be lower if it collapses." She almost laughed. He shifted in the chair and pain crossed his face. Harriet wrapped the bandage. "You will stay off that leg tomorrow?" "No." "Yes, I have a herd to move." "Then the herd will move the next day." He looked toward the door, where Caleb and Ruth's shadows showed beneath the crack. "I cannot stop." Harriet understood he was not speaking about cattle. She tied the bandage more gently. "You can stop for 1 day without abandoning them." His eyes lifted to hers. The line of his mouth tightened. "I did that once," he said. "When?" "The night my sister died." Harriet remained still. Malachi stared past her toward the dark window. Her fever had worsened. "I had been awake 3 nights. The doctor said she might hold until morning, so I went to the barn and slept in the hay. Caleb found me at dawn. By then she was gone. That was not abandonment. I was not there. You were exhausted. I was not there." The words were hard and flat, because anything softer would have broken. Harriet laid the clean cloth over his knee. My father died with me, holding his hands, she said. For years I believed that meant I had done something useful. It did not. He still died. Malachi looked at her. Being present is not the same as having power. He said nothing. Harriet gathered the bloody cloth. At the door, his voice stopped her. Miss Gentry, she turned. Thank you. It was not for the stitching. She nodded and carried the basin outside. The following morning, Malachi found his crutches leaning beside the bed. Harriet had made them from 2 broom handles, leather straps, and a crosspiece cut from a broken chair. They are ugly, he said. They suit your disposition. Caleb choked on his biscuit. Malachi looked at Harriet for a long moment. Then he used the crutches. By the time his leg healed, the children had stopped asking when Harriet would leave. That frightened her more than she expected. She had come to the Sawyer Ranch because she possessed $1.40. She had stayed because work was better than humiliation. Yet somewhere between planting beans and stitching Malachi's leg, necessity had shifted into something harder to name. She began listening for the sound of his horse in the evening. She knew which board on the porch creaked beneath his weight. She learned that when Malachi was troubled, he sharpened tools already sharp. When he was angry, he became careful with his voice. When he was pleased, he stood with one shoulder against the kitchen doorway and watched without joining. He learned things about her too. He set a stool near the pump because her leg ached after carrying water. He replaced the high latch on the barn door with one she could reach without stretching. He never commented when she rubbed her knee before a storm. One Sunday, he left a small bottle of liniment beside her plate. No note, no explanation. Harriet placed coffee beside his elbow and made no mention of that either. They attended church in Red Mesa on the first Sunday of September. Harriet wore her best brown dress and Evelyn's silver brooch. She had not intended to wear the blue shawl, but Ruth carried it from the bedroom and wrapped it around Harriet's shoulders. It looks better moving, the child said. Malachi, waiting beside the wagon, turned when Harriet stepped onto the porch. His eyes rested on the shawl. For a moment, grief stripped the guardedness from his face. Harriet reached to remove it. Do not, he said. Ruth climbed into the wagon. Caleb followed. Malachi helped Harriet onto the seat. His hand remained beneath hers one moment, longer than necessary. Red Mesa's church was whitewashed, plain, and crowded. Every head seemed to turn when Malachi entered with Harriet and the children. Mrs. Voss, who owned the dry goods store with her husband, smiled too brightly. Miss Gentry, how fortunate you found employment. Harriet heard the unasked question beneath it. How fortunate someone had taken in what Silas Crow rejected. I have been fortunate in several ways, she replied. Across the aisle, Silas sat beside the banker, Mr. Pritchard. He did not look at her until the congregation rose for the hymn. Then his gaze moved over the blue shawl, the children, and Malachi standing at Harriet's side. His mouth hardened. After the service, people gathered beneath the cottonwoods for lemonade and cake. Ruth stayed close to Harriet's skirt. Caleb went to see a litter of pups behind the parsonage. Malachi spoke with a neighboring rancher. Harriet was pouring lemonade when Silas approached. I hear Sawyer pays you. He does. Must be a comfort. Work often is. Silas smiled without warmth. He cannot afford hired help. That is his concern. Everything becomes the bank's concern eventually. Harriet set down the dipper. What do you mean? Silas glanced toward Malachi. Sawyer owes Pritchard more than that ranch is worth. Come winter, he will lose the north pasture. By spring the house. Harriet's stomach tightened. You appear unusually pleased by another man's difficulty. I offered to buy him out at a fair price. Silas leaned closer. Fair is what a desperate man accepts. Ruth's hand found Harriet's. Silas looked down at the child. You should not become attached. Miss Gentry has a habit of arriving under false expectations. Harriet felt Ruth's fingers stiffen. Before she could answer, Malachi appeared beside them. He did not raise his voice. Step away from her. Silas's eyebrows lifted. Which one, boss? The men faced each other beneath the cottonwoods while conversation quieted around them. Silas adjusted his coat. I was offering advice. You offered enough at the depot. I told the truth. No. You told a crowd what kind of man you are. Color rose beneath Silas' beard. Malachi placed one hand on Ruth's shoulder. Come along, he said to Harriet. She followed him to the wagon. No grand declaration passed between them. He did not ask whether Silas had hurt her. He simply lifted Ruth onto the seat, took Harriet's lemonade cup from her shaking hand, and poured it into the dust. On the ride home, Caleb chattered about the pups. Ruth fell asleep against Harriet's side. Malachi drove with his jaw set. Near the ranch gate, Harriet said, You did not need to defend me. Yes. He kept his eyes on the horses. Yes, I did. That evening, Harriet found the banknote behind the mantel clock. She had not been searching for it. The paper fell when she dusted the shelf. $380 remained due by December 1st. If unpaid, the bank could claim the north pasture and water rights. Harriet read the figures twice. Then she returned the note exactly where she had found it. At supper, she watched Malachi divide the last of the beef stew among the children and take mostly broth for himself. How many cattle can you sell before winter? She asked. His spoon stopped. Enough. That is not a number. It is my debt. It is the household's food, the children's home, and my wages. His eyes sharpened. Your wages will be paid. With what? Miss Gentry, Mr. Sawyer. Caleb looked between them. Ruth whispered, They are doing the names. Harriet folded her hands on the table. I kept accounts for a millinery shop in St. Joseph. Before that, I kept my father's medical ledgers. Let me see the ranch books. No, why? Because I said no. That is a reason given to children. His chair scraped back. The moment he stood, regret crossed his face, but pride held him upright. Now as they gave you work in the house, the ranch is my concern. Harriet felt heat climb her throat. You gave me work because the ranch and house were both failing. Caleb went still. Malachi's gaze flicked toward him. Harriet lowered her voice. I am not insulting you. I am offering skill. I do not need saving. No, she said, but perhaps you need counting. He stared at her. Then he took his hat from the peg and walked outside. The screen door closed softly. That was worse than a slam. Harriet lay awake long after the children slept. Near midnight, she heard Malachi moving in the kitchen. When she stepped into the passage, she found a ledger on the table beside the lamp. He sat on the porch with his back to the window. Harriet opened the book. The records were honest, but incomplete. Feed purchases had been entered without dates. Cattle losses were estimated. Interest payments were listed separately from principal. Malachi had borrowed during the drought, then again for his sister's doctor. Fees had been added each quarter. Harriet worked until the lamp burned low. By mornings she knew two things. The ranch was in danger, and the bank's figures did not agree with Malachi's receipts. She made coffee and waited. Malachi entered at sunrise, smelling of horse and cold air. Harriet placed a sheet of calculations beside his cup. You have been charged interest twice on the February payment. He did not sit. How much? $23.10. He read the page. There is also a fee for inspecting cattle that no one inspected. How do you know? Because the date listed was the day of your sister's funeral. His face changed. Harriet tapped another line. And the signature is not yours. Malachi stared at the ledger. Pritchard handled the papers. Silas Crow witnessed them. Silence filled the kitchen. Caleb and Ruth were still asleep. Malachi sat slowly. Can you prove it? Not yet. He lifted the coffee but did not drink. You should have told me about the debt, Harriet said. You would have left. She looked at him. He looked down at the cup. The words had escaped before he could guard them. Harriet's chest tightened. I had nowhere to go. You do now? Where? Mrs. Foss offered you work at the store after church? Harriet remembered the woman's bright smile and casual remark about needing a clerk. I did not accept. You could. Yes. Malachi's too moved along the chipped rim of the cup. I did not tell you, he said, because I did not want you staying from pity. Harriet folded the account sheet. Pity would not have cleaned your chimney. No, nor repaired the henhouse. No, nor planted cumbers in ground fit only for snakes. A faint line appeared beside his mouth. Harriet slid the ledger back to him. I will write to the Territorial Banking Examiner. I will also write to the County Recorder for copies of every line. That my anger Pritchard, i.e., expect it will. You are not afraid of angry men. Her fingers touched the scar at her jaw. I have survived worse things than their opinions. Malachi's eyes followed the movement. So have I, he said. Together they began to fight for the ranch. Harriet wrote letters at the kitchen table after the children slept. Malachi rode to the county seat for recorded documents. Caleb counted eggs for sale. Ruth tied beans to poles in the garden. Every small task became part of keeping the land. The late summer rains came hard. Water roared through the wash, tore loose a section of fence, and turned the corral into sucking mud. Malachi and Harriet worked beneath a gray sky to move the horses into the barn. A young mare panicked at the thunder and pulled free. Harriet caught the trailing rope. The mare jerked her off balance. Pain tore through Harriet's injured leg, but she held on, speaking low, while Malachi approached from the side. Easy, Harriet murmured. Easy, girl. No one is taking the ground from you. Malachi reached the altar. Together, they led the mare inside. Rain ran down Harriet's face and beneath her collar. Her skirt clung heavy around her boots. You should have let go, Malachi said. She would have reached the wash. She could have dragged you. She did not. His hands closed around her shoulders. The force of his fear startled them both. For a suspended moment, they stood in the barn aisle with thunder rolling above the roof. Harriet could feel the warmth of his palms through her wet dress. Malachi's eyes moved from her face to the scar at her jaw, then back. His grip loosened. You frightened me, he said. It was the nearest thing to tenderness he had ever offered. Harriet's breath caught. She might have answered if Caleb had not shouted from the doorway that the chicken coop was flooding. Malachi released her. They ran back into the rain. The storm lasted 2 days. When the sky finally cleared, the garden lay flattened. The south fence had collapsed, and mud covered the kitchen floor. Yet the house remained standing. The barn roof leaked only in one corner. The hens survived in a wash basket by the stove. Outraged but alive, they spent the next week rebuilding. Malachi set new fence posts. Harriet stretched wire. Caleb carried nails in his hat. Ruth brought water 1 tin cup at a time, spilling half before she reached them. At sunset on the final day, they stood beside the repaired gate. The land shone dark beneath the washed sky. Water dripped from mesquite leaves. The mountains were clear enough to show every fold and ridge. Malachi rested his forearms on the top rail. You did not have to stay through that storm. Harriet leaned against the post to ease her leg. I had nowhere else to be. He looked at her. She heard the mistake in her words, or perhaps the truth. Malachi turned toward the pasture. You could, he said. Could what? Have somewhere else. The wind moved softly across the wet grass. Harriet waited, but he did not explain. That night she found a new latch on her bedroom window and fresh boards beneath the sill where rain had entered. In the morning his coffee remained warm on the back of the stove. October brought cooler nights, red dust, and the first vegetables from the garden. Harriet cooked green beans with bacon ends and baked squash beneath a crust of cornmeal. She hung bundles of herbs from the rafters. Ruth's cheeks filled out. Caleb grew another inch and complained that his trousers embarrassed him. Harriet let down the hems. Malachi came in while she was kneeling before Caleb, pinning the cloth. For a moment, he stood very still. His sister's sewing basket lay open beside Harriet. Ruth sat on the floor, stitching black thread into the cornhusk doll's face. One eye was larger than the other. "She can see now," Ruth announced. Malachi removed his hat. "Ah, yes," he said. "She can." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, he brought Harriet a small wooden box. Inside lay a silver thimble, dark with age. "My mother's," he said. Harriet looked up. "You should keep it." "I have kept it." He closed her fingers around the box. "Things ought to be used." Harriet touched the engraved flowers around the thimble's rim. "Thank you." He nodded and walked away before she could say more. The letter from the territorial banking examiner arrived 3 days later. The office would investigate, but only if Harriet supplied original receipts and witnesses. Copies alone would not be enough. Several receipts were missing from Malachi's ledger. He believed his sister had placed them in a red tin box. They searched the house, barn, attic, and smokehouse. Nothing. Caleb finally remembered seeing Silas Crow carry a red box from the kitchen after the funeral. He said it had papers for the bank, the boy explained. Malachi's face went pale with anger. Harriet wrote the statement down. "Will they believe a child?" Caleb asked. "They might. What if they do not? Then we find another truth they cannot ignore." Silas came to the ranch the following afternoon. He rode through the repaired gate without calling out and tied his horse beside the porch. Harriet was hanging laundry. Malachi and Caleb were in the north pasture. Ruth sat beneath the cottonwoods, shelling beans. Silas removed his hat. "I came to offer you a kindness." Harriet continued, pinning a sheet to the line. "You should practice on someone more likely to mistake it for one." He smiled. Pritchard received a letter from Tucson. Harriet's hands paused. "The examiner, he knows you wrote it. I signed my name. He also knows you traveled west under false pretenses." Harriet fixed the last clothespin. "I did not. You cannot prove that. Neither can you prove otherwise." Silas stepped closer. "The agency sent me Evelyn's photograph because Evelyn was the woman listed in the original application." Harriet stared at him. "That is impossible." "I asked it. My sister was dead before I answered your advertisement." But she had answered another one. The wind lifted the wet sheet between them. Silas reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. Harriet recognized Evelyn's handwriting before he opened it. Her knees weakened. The letter was 4 years old. Evelyn had written to a matrimonial bureau while desperate to escape a violent husband. She had never mailed it, or Harriet had believed she had not. After Evelyn's death, Harriet had found blank forms in her sewing box and used the same bureau, never knowing her sister's application remained on file. Silas watched Harriet read. "They joined the records," he said. "Your words? Her photograph? You knew?" "Not until the agency answered my complaint." "Then, you know I did not deceive you." "I know no one else needs to hear the details." Harriet folded the letter carefully. "What do you want?" "Stop the bank inquiry. Leave Sawyer's place. I will pay your fare to Kansas City." Ruth had stopped shelling beans. Harriet could feel the child listening. "Why?" "Because Sawyer's north pasture joins land I intend to buy. The water runs through it. So, this was never only about debt." Silas' smile vanished. "Take the ticket, Harriet." "No, you think Sawyer will choose you over his ranch." "This is not about choosing me. It always becomes that." He glanced toward the house. "You have made yourself useful. That is not the same as being wanted." The words found an old wound with practiced accuracy. Harriet held the letter against her skirt. Silas stepped closer. "Men like Sawyer marry women who bring land, youth, or beauty. You arrived with a borrowed face and an empty trunk." The bluebell trunk was not empty. It held her father's medical instruments, Evelyn's brooch, 3 dresses, 2 books, and every surviving letter her family had written. But she understood his meaning. Silas mounted his horse. "As I will return tomorrow. Be reasonable." He rode away through the gate Malachi and Harriet had repaired together. Ruth stood beneath the laundry line with beans gathered in her apron. "Are you leaving?" Harriet looked at the child. "No," she said, but fear had already entered the house. That evening, Harriet told Malachi everything. She showed him Evelyn's letter. She explained the agency, the photograph, and Silas' offer. Malachi listened without interruption. When she finished, he took the letter to the lamp. "You did not know." "No, friend, it changes nothing. It changes what people can be made to believe. I do not care what they believe." "You do." His eyes hardened. "You care about the children, the ranch, your name." "I care what is true." Harriet stood from the table. "Truth is rarely the loudest voice in town." He folded Evelyn's letter and gave it back. "What are you saying?" She could not look at him. If the bank inquiry continues, Silas may accuse me publicly." Preacher may claimed the entire complaint came from a dishonest woman seeking revenge. "We have Caleb's statement. A frightened boy against a banker and a respected businessman." Malachi rose. "Silas is not respected. He has a clean coat and money. That is often close enough." "What do you want me to do?" Harriet's throat ached. "Withdraw the complaint. Negotiate more time." "No, you may lose everything." "I may lose it anyway." "The children. Do not use them to make this decision for me." The sharpness in his voice cut the room. Harriet went still. Malachi closed his eyes. When he opened them, anger had become weariness. "I am sorry." She pressed Evelyn's letter between her palms. "I will go to Mrs. Voss tomorrow. If I am no longer under your roof, Silas cannot claim you are protecting me for personal reasons." "Are you asking me to let you leave?" "I am telling you what is sensible." His face became unreadable. "I see." He took his hat from the peg. Harriet waited for him to argue. He did not. The screen door closed behind him. She heard him enter the barn. Much later, after the children slept, Harriet packed the bluebell trunk. She folded the gray dress he had worn at the depot. She placed the silver thimble in its wooden box and left it on the kitchen table. At dawn, she found Malachi hitching the wagon. Neither spoke as he lifted her trunk into the back. Caleb stood on the porch, furious, tears bright in his eyes. "You said a bent nail was not a judgment." Harriet swallowed. "It is not? Then why are you quitting?" "I am not quitting. You are leaving." Ruth held the faceless doll, though it had eyes now. Harriet knelt and embraced them both. Caleb kept his arms stiff at his sides. Ruth clung hard enough to hurt. Malachi waited beside the wagon. The ride to town took nearly 3 hours. They passed the repaired fence, the wet wash, the ridge where the land opened toward Red Mesa. Harriet held her hands beneath the blue shawl and watched the ranch disappear. Malachi said nothing. At the depot, the eastbound train was due within 20 minutes. Mrs. Voss had offered Harriet work, but the room above the store would not be ready for a week. Silas had left an envelope with the station master containing a ticket to Kansas City. Harriet stared at the ticket. It would be simple to use it. She could return east, find another position, and let the Sawyer Ranch become a memory marked by coffee, rain, and a man who had once said she frightened him. The train whistle sounded beyond the ridge. Malachi lifted her trunk from the wagon. Harriet touched the brass handle. "Thank you," she said. His face was pale beneath the sun. "For what?" "For giving me work when no one else would." The whistle sounded again. Malachi looked toward the track. Then he lifted the trunk back into the wagon. Harriet stared at him. "What are you doing?" He tied the rope across the bluebells. "Taking you home, Malachi. The house is yours too." One sentence. No speech, no promise of safety. He climbed onto the wagon seat and held out his hand. The train entered the station behind them in a roar of steam. Harriet looked at his hand. Then she placed hers in it. He pulled her onto the seat. They drove away before the train stopped moving. Silas was waiting at the Sawyer Ranch with banker Pritchard and Sheriff Amos Reed. Caleb and Ruth stood inside the doorway. Pritchard held a sheaf of papers. "I came to discuss the allegations made against my bank," he said. Malachi climbed down from the wagon. "Discuss them." Pritchard's gaze shifted to Harriet. "Privately, no." Silas stepped forward. "Sawyer, this woman misrepresented herself to secure a marriage contract." Harriet descended carefully. Malachi moved beside her. "She did not." Silas drew Evelyn's application from his pocket. "Her family submitted false documents. My sister submitted that before I ever knew of you," Harriet said. "The agency confused our records." "A convenient tell." Sheriff Reed rubbed his mustache. "Crow, do you have evidence she knowingly sent the photograph?" Silas hesitated. "No, but—" "Then stop saying she did." Pritchard cleared his throat. "The woman's character is not the central issue. Sawyer's account remains in default." Harriet reached into her satchel and removed a copied ledger. "Your bank charged duplicate interest, false inspection fees, and payments that do not match the county record. Copies prove nothing. The original receipts were removed from this house." Pritchard looked at Malachi. "That is a serious accusation." Caleb stepped onto the porch. "I saw Mr. Crow take Mama's red box." Silas turned. "You saw no such thing." "I did." "You were a grieving child." "I still had eyes." Ruth came to stand beside her brother. Silas' face reddened. Pritchard gathered his papers. "Unless original receipts appear, the lien stands. Payment is due in 6 weeks." He mounted his horse. Silas lingered. "This ends one way, Sawyer. You lose the pasture, or you sell it to me." Malachi's voice remained quiet. "Leave my land." Silas looked at Harriet. "You truly think he sees something worth keeping?" Malachi stepped between them. "Yes." Silas waited. Malachi's next words carried across the yard. "You ordered a picture. I chose the woman." Harriet could not breathe. The sheriff looked away, giving her privacy in the only manner available. Silas mounted his horse and followed the banker through the gate. After they vanished, Malachi turned toward Harriet. His face held no triumph, only uncertainty, as though he had opened a door and did not know whether she would cross it. "You did not ask me," she said. "To stay, to be chosen." His jaw shifted. "I know." Harriet looked at the children, the worn porch, and the bluebell trunks still tied in the wagon. "Do not choose me because Silas rejected me." "I did not." "Do you not choose me because the house needs work?" I can hire work." "With what money?" A tired smile touched his face. "Fair point." She stepped closer. "Why then?" Malachi glanced toward Caleb and Ruth. "Not here." Harriet understood. Some truths needed darkness and quiet. That night after the children slept, they sat on the porch beneath a clear sky. The lamp behind them cast a warm square across the boards. Crickets sounded near the garden. One of the horses moved softly in the corral. Malachi held his hat between his hands. "I did not choose you at the depot," he said. "I offered work." "I know." "I did not choose you when you fixed the pump or fed the children." Harriet waited. "I think it happened slowly enough that I cannot name the day." His tone traced the hat brim. "Might be when you told Caleb a bent nail was not a judgment. Might be when you held that mare in the storm. Might be every morning I found coffee waiting, and knew someone had remembered I would be cold." Harriet looked at her hands. "I am not Evelyn. I know. I am not the woman in the photograph. I know. My leg will worsen with age. I know. The scar will remain. I know." She looked at him. "What do you see, Malachi?" His answer came after a long silence. "You. Nothing more." It was enough to bring tears to Harriet's eyes. He did not touch her until she turned her hand palm upward on the board between them. Then he placed his hand over hers. Neither spoke. The fragile peace lasted 4 days. On the 5th, Caleb disappeared. He had heard Malachi and Harriet discussing the missing red box. Convinced he could save the ranch, he saddled the old pony and rode toward the abandoned line shack where his mother had once stored household goods. A dust storm rose before noon. By the time they discovered he was gone, the northern sky had become a wall of brown. Malachi saddled immediately. Harriet tied a wet cloth around Ruth's face and took her to Mrs. Renshaw's house. Then she returned to the ranch and harnessed the wagon. "You are not coming," Malachi shouted over the wind. "I know where the old household trumps were stored. You can barely see the road. Neither can you." Sand lashed the yard. He grabbed her bridle. "Eoth. The wagon overturns. Caleb is hurt. You will need help." Their eyes met through the blowing dust. Malachi released the bridle. They rode north together. The world vanished beyond a few yards. Fence posts appeared and disappeared like dark figures. Harriet kept the wagon wheels in the shallow rut, while Malachi searched ahead on horseback. They found the pony first, reins tangled in a mesquite bush. Then they heard Caleb calling. He had reached the line shack before the storm. Part of the roof had collapsed, pinning his leg beneath a beam. Malachi threw himself from the saddle and crawled through the broken doorway. Harriet followed. Dust poured through the roof gaps. Caleb's face was white beneath the dirt. "I found it," he gasped. Beside him lay a red tin box. Malachi gripped the fallen beam. Harriet wedged a broken chair leg beneath it. "Lift when I say." Together, they raised the timber enough for Caleb to drag free. His ankle was badly swollen, but not broken. Malachi pulled him against his chest. "You never leave without telling me," he said, his voice shaking. "Never." Caleb clung to him. "I was helping." "You were." Malachi closed his eyes. "You were also a fool." Harriet took the red box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay receipts, loan papers, and a small book in Malachi's sister's handwriting. They returned to the ranch after dark. The storm had torn the laundry line from the porch and ripped half the shingles from the barn. Yet, no one spoke of repairs that night. Caleb lay on the sofa with his ankle wrapped. Ruth slept beside him, one hand gripping his sleeve. Harriet opened the red box at the kitchen table. The papers proved everything. Pritchard had altered interest entries. Silas had witnessed false inspection statements. Worse, the banker had issued private loans to Silas, using threatened ranch properties as security before the properties were legally seized. Malachi read the documents in silence. "We take them to Sheriff Reed tomorrow," Harriet said. Malachi nodded. Then he looked toward Caleb. "I nearly lost him. You found him. I should have known what he planned. He is 9. I am responsible." Harriet reached across the table. "You are responsible for loving him, not for predicting every foolish thought he has until he is grown." Malachi stared at her hand. "I do not know how to do this. Neither does anyone. You don't know." Harriet glanced toward the sleeping children. "I simply continue." His fingers closed around hers. "I want you to continue here." Her heart beat hard. "As your employee?" "No." The answer was quiet. He rose and crossed to the mantel. From behind the clock, he removed a small cloth bundle. Inside was a plain gold ring. "My mother's," he said. "Then my sister's." Harriet did not reach for it. "Malachi, I am not asking tonight. Why show me? Because I have spent most of my life hiding what I want until wanting it could not matter." He wrapped the ring again. "I am done hiding." The next morning, they rode to Red Mesa with the children, the red box, and every original receipt. Sheriff Reed summoned the territorial judge, who happened to be holding court in the town hall. Word spread faster than dust before wind. By noon, half the town had gathered. Pritchard stood beside Silas at the front of the hall. Both men wore dark coats. Harriet wore her gray depot dress, cleaned and mended. The blue shawl rested around her shoulders. The judge examined the papers one by one. He questioned Malachi, then Caleb, then Harriet. Silas' attorney tried to turn the hearing toward the matrimonial agency. Miss Gentry, is it not true that you came to Arizona using another woman's photograph? No, was another woman's photograph included in the correspondence. Ice. And you benefited from that deception. Harriet looked across the room at Silas. I crossed the country to marry a man who rejected me before asking a single honest question. I lost my savings, my home, and what remained of my reputation. I do not recognize the benefit. A few people lowered their eyes. The attorney paced. You then entered Mr. Sawyer's household as a paid worker, and now expect to marry him. Murmurs rose. Malachi stood. The judge raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Sawyer. Malachi remained standing. With respect, Judge, my intentions are not evidence against her. The attorney smiled. Your intentions show bias. My bias began after I learned her character. Your client's began before he did. The judge struck the table with his gavel. Sit down. Malachi sat. The hearing continued. The bank records were undeniable. Pritchard had falsified charges on 4 ranch accounts. Not only Malachi's. Silas had profited from 2 foreclosures and intended to acquire Sawyer's water rights for less than half their value. By sunset, Sheriff Reed placed Pritchard under arrest for fraud and ordered Silas held as a material conspirator. Silas turned toward Harriet as the sheriff took his arm. This is because of you. Harriet stood. No, she said. This is because of what you did when you believed no one worth seeing was watching. The town heard every word. Outside the hall, people crowded the boardwalk. Mrs. Voss approached Harriet. Her face was pale with embarrassment. Miss Gentry, I fear we were unkind when you arrived. Harriet waited. Mrs. Voss looked toward the women who had laughed at the depot. We believed Mr. Crow. You found it convenient to believe him. Yes. The admission cost her something. I am sorry, Harriet nodded. She did not offer immediate forgiveness to make the woman comfortable. Behind her, Malachi descended the steps with Caleb and Ruth. Sheriff Reed had confirmed that the fraudulent fees would be removed from Malachi's account. The ranch still owed money, but far less than Pritchard claimed. Enough cattle could be sold without losing the pasture or water. The land was safe. For the first time in months, Malachi's shoulders did not appear braced against an invisible weight. Silas was being led toward the jail. He stopped near the wagon. His gaze moved from Harriet to Malachi. You will regret this, he said. She is still not what any man orders. Malachi's hands settled at the small of Harriet's back. No, he said. She is more than a man knows to ask for. Silas had no answer. The sheriff led him away. Winter came gently that year. The first frost silvered the garden, but spared the late squash beneath Harriet's coverings. Malachi sold 12 cattle, paid the corrected balance, and kept the north pasture. With the remaining money, he bought shingles, lumber, a new pump cylinder, and 2 bolts of cloth. The ranch changed piece by piece. Malachi and Caleb rebuilt the barn roof. Harriet and Ruth sewed curtains for the kitchen, pale yellow with tiny brown flowers. The corral received new rails. The gate no longer sagged. A proper gravel path ran from the porch to the pump. They whitewashed the children's room. Harriet cleaned the back bedroom but left the blue shawl on its peg until one evening Malachi carried it to her. It belongs with you now, he said. Harriet held the worn wool against her chest. Are you certain? No, she smiled. He touched the edge of the shawl. But I am learning certainty is not required for every good thing. He asked her to marry him beside the woodpile on a cold December morning. There was no audience except 3 hens and Caleb, who was pretending not to listen from behind the chicken house. Malachi had been splitting logs. Harriet came outside with coffee and found him holding his mother's ring. He did not kneel. The ground was muddy, and neither of them cared for unnecessary theater. I cannot promise an easy life," he said. "I would distrust you if you did. I am stubborn. I am stubborn. Yes, I will make mistakes. Many." His mouth moved. "I love you." The words were nearly lost beneath the sound of the windmill beginning to turn. Harriet had waited months to hear them, yet she discovered they were not what convinced her. She had been convinced by the stool beside the pump, the repaired window, the warm coffee, the hand held out at the depot, and the way he had placed himself between her and every voice that wished to make her smile. She set the coffee cups on the chopping block. "I love you too." Malachi released a breath. "Yes, that a yes? That depend." His expression changed. "On what?" "Whether I keep my wages through the wedding." From behind the chicken house, Caleb burst into laughter. Malachi looked toward the sound. "You were listening?" "Nah, go tell Ruth." Caleb ran for the house. Malachi turned back to Harriet. "You can keep the wages. For how long?" "As long as you continue keeping the accounts. That might be forever." "I was hoping." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if the women before her had left room. They married in the little white church at Red Mesa on the final Sunday before Christmas. Mrs. Voss altered Harriet's brown dress and refused payment. Mr. Renshaw gave Malachi a polished set of harness buckles. Sheriff Reed stood as witness. Caleb carried the ring and nearly dropped it through a crack in the floor. Ruth scattered dried marigold petals Harriet had saved from the garden. When the preacher asked who gave Harriet in marriage, Harriet answered for herself, "I do." No one laughed. Malachi looked at her with such quiet pride that the scar along her jaw felt, for once, like no more than a line drawn by an old fire that had failed to keep her from arriving. They returned to the ranch by wagon, beneath a sky washed gold with winter light. That evening Harriet cooked beef with onions and the last garden potatoes. Caleb set the table. Ruth placed the doll with uneven eyes on a chair between them, until Malachi insisted dolls did not require full portions. The stove burned warm. Yellow curtains stirred at the window. Outside, horses moved behind a sound corral fence. The repaired pump shone faintly beneath the moon. Split wood stood stacked beneath the porch roof, enough to last until spring. Malachi came in carrying another armful and stamped dust from his boots. Harriet poured coffee into his tin cup before he asked. He hung his coat by the door and leaned down to kiss her temple, just above the scar. The children argued over the largest biscuit. The hens settled in their clean boxes. The barn roof held, and the bluebell trunk, once abandoned on a station platform, rested open at the foot of Harriet's bed, no longer packed for leaving. Years later, people in Red Mesa would remember the fraud, the hearing, and the day a banker went to jail. Some would remember how Silas Crow said Harriet Gentry was not what he ordered. But those who knew the Sawyer Ranch best remembered smaller things. A garden growing where the ground had looked barren, children laughing in a house once ruled by grief, and a prairie rancher who finally understood that love was not delivered according to a man's list. It arrived carrying its own name, and the wise man made room for it.